Ladies and gentlemen, mesdames et messieurs, chers collègues, chers étudiants, chères étudiantes, comme doyenne de la faculté ENAC, j'ai l'honneur ce soir de vous accueillir pour 2 leçons inaugurales et j'espère que vous serez des nôtres jusqu'à la partie d'échange festif autour de l'apéritif qui suivra ensuite. Pour une fois ce soir, je vais me proposer de les présenter chacun dans leur deuxième langue, puisque je ne parle pas leur première, et donc de commencer en français pour présenter Nicola Braghieri, et je passerai à l'anglais pour parler de Paolo Tombesi. Donc, j'ai le très grand plaisir d'introduire ce soir la leçon inaugurale du professeur Nicola Braghieri, qui a été nommé à l'EPFL il y a déjà 4 ans. Il a débuté en ENAC en juillet 2013, plus ou moins en même temps que j'ai commencé à avoir le plaisir de diriger cette faculté. 2 ans plus tard, il a accepté en septembre 2015 de reprendre la direction de la section d'architecture, ce pour lequel je le remercie grandement. Il est donc grand temps de célébrer cette leçon inaugurale qui coïncide d'ailleurs avec l'année de son 50e anniversaire, donc avec un peu d'avance. Bon anniversaire. Alors, en quelques mots, son parcours qui nous a amené le professeur Braghieri jusqu'aux portes de l'EPFL. Il a donc fait ses études classiques et son diplôme, qu'on appelle magistral, au Polytechnique de Milan, avec un mémoire sur l'architecture alpine. Il a ensuite fait son doctorat à l'Université de Gênes, avec une recherche sur la théorie de la tradition. De très nombreuses activités professorales ont rythmé son parcours. Il a été professeur à la faculté d'architecture de Gênes, titulaire de la chaire de projet et théorie du projet. Il est d'ailleurs resté membre du conseil des professeurs de l'école doctorale et professeur associé. Il est aussi professeur à la Haute École européenne d'architecture urbaine de Naples et professeur ad intérim à l'Université technique de Darmstadt, ainsi que professeur invité à l'ETHZ et à l'EPFL durant plusieurs années, ce qui nous a permis de faire sa connaissance avant de l'accueillir ici. Conférencier et enseignant dans plusieurs universités européennes et dans les grandes universités d'Italie, Nicola Braghieri a cherché à développer une méthode pédagogique élémentaire qui pose en termes réalistes la relation entre la théorie, la pratique et la poétique dans le projet et la figuration de l'architecture. Ses études et ses recherches concernent principalement les thématiques de la figuration architecturale, de la tradition, de la rhétorique et de la tectonique. Dans son engagement d'enseignant comme dans son activité d'architecte, il a toujours consacré une attention très particulière à la simplification technique ainsi qu'à la limitation du gaspillage des ressources, ce qui est effectivement une question primordiale aujourd'hui. Dans son parcours professionnel, qu'il a mené parallèlement à son activité d'enseignement et de recherche, il a travaillé comme architecte indépendant, participant à des concours, réalisant des projets ainsi que des bâtiments. Membre du collectif AFS à Berlin, il a ensuite ouvert son propre studio à Milan en 1996, s'est associé puis a cofondé il y a 10 ans avec sa femme Alessandra Spada le studio XM Architetti à Milan et à Genève. En 2002, il a remporté le concours international pour un nouveau quartier d'habitation à Settimo Milanese. En 2011, il a remporté celui de Vendeuvre Esplanade dans le canton de Genève. Il a plusieurs fois sorti également finaliste, comme pour le centre de formation professionnelle à Sasso Marconi, pour l'extension de la bibliothèque de Stockholm, pour le pavillon suisse dans l'Expo 2015 et pour un quartier de 2000 habitants à Genève, les Vernets. En termes de publication, on trouve beaucoup d'ouvrages publiés par Nicola Braghieri, des ouvrages théoriques traduits en français et en espagnol, comme sa traduction et l'adaptation aussi de Experiencing Architecture de Steen Eiler Rasmussen également. Il a rédigé des essais édités dans plusieurs revues scientifiques et des articles publiés dans plusieurs magazines d'architecture. Il a collaboré avec un hebdomadaire culturel et est auteur d'une émission d'architecture radiophonique. Il est rédacteur du magazine d'architecture Casabella. Ses projets sont publiés dans des volumes collectifs et des magazines. Son travail a été l'objet d'une exposition personnelle sous le patronage du ministère allemand des Affaires étrangères. Enfin, il est actif sous plusieurs pseudonymes dans le domaine des beaux-arts numériques. Il a produit collages numériques et mécaniques, s'occupe de falsification photographique et de contrefaçon postale. 2 mots qui font peur, mais qui, dans son cas, il ne s'est jamais intéressé à étendre ses compétences de falsificateur en dehors de ses paysages construits, heureusement. Donc, pour conclure, avant de lui laisser la parole, je voudrais le remercier particulièrement de nous avoir rejoints à l'EPFL et également pour son engagement comme directeur d'une des plus grandes sections de l'EPFL, qui représente donc une grande tâche. Merci beaucoup, Nicolas. The floor is yours.
Bien. Merci, ma chère Marélie. Merci beaucoup. Merci pour l'invitation et pour avoir organisé cette soirée. Merci à tout le monde d'être ici, beaucoup de gens. Merci aussi aux étudiants. Je me dois excuser pour les retards. En effet, j'ai 4 années de retard, mais ça est bien. Et je dois naturellement maintenant me présenter officiellement. Tout d'abord, j'essayais de comprendre qu'est-ce que c'est une leçon inaugurale. Selon la tradition académique, je cherchais aussi sur Wikipédia, naturellement, c'est toujours comme ça. Ce n'est pas une conférence, c'est une leçon, qui sont des choses très différentes. Donc, c'est une lectio, c'est un peu à la latin. La lectio doit être une lecture à l'anglais. Littéralement, de texte à lire. Je n'aime pas lire, en général, surtout dans une langue que je n'ai trop bien maîtrisée, comme ça. Parce que malheureusement, je ne peux pas voir ce qu'il passe arrière de moi. Bien. Dans les universités médiévales, là vient la lectio, était une lecture commentaire de textes philosophiques, Sant'Agostino, mais aussi Aristote, Vrai et toi. La culture ancienne était en continue relecture de textes, commentaires, traductions, trahison aussi, des textes anciens, des Alte Masters, des Old Masters. Également pour les architectes, c'était plus ou moins la même chose. Théorie et architecture de la Renaissance ont été... Je m'excuse, il n'y a aucune manière de voir qu'est-ce qu'il passe là, parce que je... Ah, bien. On était des translatio et des restitutio. Bien sûr, je ne voulais pas du tout réduire toute l'architecture de la Renaissance et toute la littérature de l'architecture de la Renaissance, traité, commentaire, à quelque chose d'une relecture. Mais on était des commentaires raisonnés. De Vitruve, les grands textes classiques dans la philosophie. Mais un commentarius, on était appelé comme ça, était une relecture cum mente, avec des raisonnements, avec des interprétations personnelles, avec une capacité de comparaison, de mettre en relation des choses de nature différente, parce que dans la grande culture ancienne, on était plus importante les relations entre les choses que les choses leur-mêmes, avec une grande capacité d'invention. J'ai mis là un texte. La lecture inaugurale donne une allure, un rite d'initiation, plus que de présentation. Je suis ici aussi pour prendre un peu des auguri, on dit en latin, et les meilleurs vœux. Je commence donc à l'ancienne avec une lecture très sérieuse et engagée. Il y a un vrai passage de la poétique d'Aristote. Je voudrais construire ce soir la lectio sur ce passage de la poétique. Attention à la traduction historique, chroniqueur, qui a été faite par Cvetan Todorov, donc nous pouvons aussi mettre la main sur les faux. Par rapport à le plus classique historien, c'est pour toi aussi, Roberto, pour respect pour nos collègues historiens d'architecture, qui jamais doit être confondu con qui fait de la chronique. Il est intéressant un exercice de rhétorique pour remplacer poète et architecte, et chroniqueur, pourquoi pas non, avec les techniciens. Je laisse là le texte. Il y a des passages qui sont importants. Le poète ne vient pas parce qu'il s'exprime avec de l'autre en prose. La question fondamentale, c'est la phrase finale. C'est pour cette raison que la poésie est plus philosophique et plus noble que la chronique. La poésie traite plutôt du général, la chronique du particulier. À supposer même qu'il compose un poème sur des événements réels arrivés, il n'est pas moins poète, car rien n'empêche que certains événements réels ne soient ceux qui pourront arriver dans l'ordre du vraisemblable, du possible. Vraisemblable ou possible. Aristote réfléchit sur la relation entre narration et réalité. La narration par Aristote était la tragédie rédigée par un poète. Pour nous architectes, c'est une question incontournable, un enjeu vital, cette question de narration et de réalité. Dans le passage, Aristote souligne deux choses fondamentales, que la nature de la poésie est anticipatrice et visionnaire. Et aussi souligne que les poètes traitent des choses qui peuvent arriver, se produire selon nécessité ou vraisemblance. Donc, la nature anticipatrice, la vraisemblance et la nécessité sont les questions fondamentales de la poésie pour Aristote. En général, Aristote, lui-même, fonde les discours, son logos, sur deux pierres angulaires. L'analogie, j'ai fait un cours, une leçon ici il y a quelques années, et la vraisemblance, qui est le sujet aujourd'hui. Selon la conception aristotélicienne de la poésie, la vraisemblance est une condition nécessaire de la narration. Le récit, pour être efficace, compose les éléments selon des règles de vraisemblance. Donc, la tragédie est toute en composition. Dans la tragédie, la poésie est la narration de l'histoire, selon Aristote. Par analogie, on peut alors dire, et ça c'est l'hypothèse que je cherche à démontrer ce soir, que dans l'architecture, la peinture devient le récit de la construction. Il y a bien sûr les dessins techniques qui, comme la chronique qu'a bien défini Aristote, est capable de transmettre seulement des choses comme elles sont, les choses réelles, qui pour Aristote, et aussi pour moi, ne sont pas particulièrement intéressantes. Il est bien, pour me suivre, de prendre en compte la différence entre les vrais et les réels dans la culture des anciens. Jamais oublier l'allégorie de la caverne de Platon. Autre question fondamentale de ce passage de la poétique, c'est que la notion de vraisemblable identifie une logique de l'opinion, la doxa pour les anciens, non pas encore l'épistémé. Donc le récit acquis une autonomie narrative du réel. Nous, les architectes, nous sommes extrêmement fascinés par cette question d'autonomie du projet ou du projet autonome. La vraisemblance est la garantie de cette autonomie du projet, autonomie narrative. La vraisemblance complète les cartes, remplit les vides entre la poésie et l'histoire. La vraisemblance complète les cartes, remplit les vides entre l'architecture et la construction. Architecture et construction. Je touche sur une clé essentielle à laquelle je reviendrai plus tard. Dans l'Antiquité, l'architecture était une discipline non seulement technique, ça est toujours à souvenir, bien qu'elle ait été souvent classée comme un art mécanique. Elle, naturellement, doit se confronter avec la technique, toujours aussi aujourd'hui. Mais elle n'était pas une discipline uniquement technique. Grâce à son épaisseur narrative, encore, pour revenir à la tragédie, visionnaire et anticipateur, ou selon Aristote, que Vitruve a bien défini, l'architecture a toujours clairement conservé son valeur intellectuelle. Je limite à dire que l'architecte, selon Vitruve, devait avoir beaucoup de connaissances, savoir un peu de tout. Architectonia, en grec ancien, est simplement un travail ingénieux. J'ai cherché sur mon ancien vocabulaire de grec. Et j'ai trouvé cette définition. Ingénieux. Ingénieux et intellectuel sont supposables dans les définitions d'architectonia. Architectonema, que j'ai jamais trouvé sur le texte d'architecture, mais j'ai trouvé sur le vocabulaire, est la construction, mais aussi la guerre, dans la guerre est l'astuce, la capacité de construire des stratégies. Aristote, dans les passages que j'ai lus, ouvre implicitement une question clé, encore, maintenant, la relation entre la connaissance et l'imagination, un binôme, un mariage difficile dans la philosophie de l'Antiquité. La connaissance est la raison d'être des arts mécaniques, comme l'imagination est le moteur puissant des arts libéraux. Ce rapport contraste, un rapport contraste entre connaissance et imagination, c'est la grande question de la théorie architecturale, question développée en dichotomie entre sensibilité et raison, pensée inductive et pensée déductive, expérience et mémoire est un peu continuée. Où sommes-nous arrivés? À ce sujet, Rudolf Arnheim, a souligné une chose importante, qu'il y a un préjuge de supériorité du pensée sur la perception, de la philosophie sur l'art, de la dissertation sur la divulgation, de la science sur la technique, de la disputatio sur la lectio. Et que ça traduit en préjugé de supériorité du texte toujours sur l'image. Mais souvent, il a bien payé l'image, l'artiste. Et les artistes sont bien plus riches que les philosophes aussi aujourd'hui. Autre raison par laquelle l'art expressif est toujours négligé, vieille histoire de l'adoration du vœu d'or et de la destruction des icônes. Ah, je suis arrivé à Kirchner. Cette question imagination-connaissance est aussi cruciale pour l'Église, où dans le XVIIe, XVIIIe siècle, finalement, la croyance et les mythes sont entrés en collision avec les découvertes scientifiques, les voyages, la presse, aussi la bourgeoisie éduquée. Je me réfère aux théologiciens, scientifiques, architectes, qui ont dû donner une explication scientifique au mystère de la Bible, ou tout simplement au mythe de l'Antiquité, dans lequel l'histoire sacrée, les antiquités et les légendes profanes ont construit une imagerie scientifique extraordinaire. Athanasius Kirchner, mon grand amour, jésuite allemand, d'esprit scientifique et d'une imagination extraordinaire. Il a été chargé d'expliquer par le pape, avec vraisemblance, c'est écrit comme ça, scientifique, le plus grand mystère des Écritures anciennes. Il a calculé les dimensions de l'arche de Noé, la dimension des bois, de la tour de Babel et du temple de Salomon, en mélangeant l'archéologie avec la théologie, l'histoire avec les mythes. Encore plus intéressant probablement a été son élève Bernard Lamy, théologien cartésien, au même temps, quel courage, quel théologiste cartésien. Il a également illustré la Bible, l'Ancien Testament. Et Johann Bernhard Fischer von Erlach, quelques années plus tard bien sûr, qui a construit sa manière visionnaire de faire architecture avec la reconstruction imaginaire des merveilles de l'Antiquité, du Temple de Salomon, Santa Sofia de Constantinople, Londres, Berlin et Vienne. Et à la fin, bien plus tard, mais pas plus qu'une centaine d'années, Piranesi, qui a mis au service de l'archéologie son attitude visionnaire, presque lysergique, on peut dire, où le comptoir a nourri ses hallucinations quotidiennes avec un répertoire d'antiquité. Bien, la question de la relation connaissance-imagination, ça c'est une belle image d'une copie des Praise of Folly d'Erasmus de Rotterdam avec tous les dessins à la main de Hans Holbein à côté. Est encore aujourd'hui crucial dans le monde scientifique. Connaissance-imagination. Les scientifiques semblent se désintéresser de la figuration, l'illustration par image, des phénomènes qui ne peuvent pas être observés. Observer aujourd'hui veut dire toutes les choses que nous pouvons photographier seulement, sinon ne sont pas possibles d'être dessinées. Les livres des ingénieurs, des physiciens, mais aussi des biologistes et des anatomistes, aujourd'hui sont d'une pauvreté figurative incroyable, hallucinante, je peux dire, si je pense aux livres seulement des années 60, la beauté des livres que nous pouvons trouver dans les trocs. La question est difficile. La question est le difficile mariage toujours avec ce qu'il existe et qu'il est observable et avec ce qu'il n'existe pas encore ou peut être seulement imaginé. Mais comme nous pouvons faire, nous architectes, sans imaginer quelque chose qui n'existe pas encore. La question est difficile, est très difficile, parce que c'est un difficile rapport entre ce qui voit les yeux du corps et les yeux de l'esprit. La relation entre imagination et connaissance est résolue traditionnellement à travers les différents outils que chaque discipline peut utiliser. Les écrivains utilisent l'art poétique. Les scientifiques utilisent l'art abstrait, probablement, si je pense aussi là à cette belle image. Les architectes ont utilisé l'art expressif. C'est pourquoi les poètes, selon Aristote, sont importants pour raconter l'histoire. Alors, je peux soutenir sans hasard, sans aucun hasard, que les artistes sont importants pour raconter aussi les phénomènes scientifiques. À propos de la peinture, nous ne devons jamais oublier que dans le 10e livre de Edificatoria de Leon Battista Alberti, il y a un passage déconcertant. Pour dire que l'art sont utiles à l'architecte, voire totalement nécessaires, ce sont la peinture, la portraiture, a dit aussi Todorov dans une deuxième traduction, étaient les mathématiques, car des autres, il me chope s'il est docte ou non. Pour Alberti, donc, seulement la mathématique, selon cette grande humaniste de Renaissance, et selon son grand traducteur, l'architecte est bien que tu dis seulement la mathématique est apprendre à peindre des portraits. Une interprétation très large de Vitruvio, un peu loin, je peux dire, de Vitruve, qui disait dans les Proemio que l'architecte doit savoir un peu de tout, je le répète. Vignola, seulement une centaine d'années plus tard qu'Alberti même, il a écrit explicitement dans l'introduction à son manuel des ordonnances, il est bien que l'architecte regarde les images, parce qu'il n'a pas beaucoup de temps pour lire les textes. L'objet, pas le sujet de la tragédie, selon Aristote, n'est pas le réel, qui vient de on, de einai, l'être, essere, l'exister, le réel, n'est pas le vrai aussi, que dans la philosophie grecque n'était pas encore bien défini, s'utilise alethei avec un alpha privative. Le vrai est quelque chose qui n'est pas faux. C'est déjà un jeu pas mal. Et n'existait pas le feu dans la littérature et la philosophie ancienne comme est interprétée aujourd'hui. Pseudo s'est utilisé, le concept n'est pas encore dévolu. Mais existe le vraisemblable, quelque chose qui doit apparaître vrai. Pourquoi la procédure de description vraisemblable fait l'objet lui-même de vraisemblable? Parce que la tragédie et le dessin sont les miroirs de la vie réelle, on peut dire, et de la réelle construction, alors, les dessins d'architecture. Mais ils ont besoin d'une condition vraisemblable pour être narrés. Une condition, dite Aristote, conforme aux expectatives. C'est la question de l'empathie, entrer dans les choses. La fiction est narration des événements qui ne sont pas produits, mais il faut nécessairement narrer de manière similaire, dit Aristote. Et je pense toujours à les images d'architecture, à ce qui ont lieu, similaires à la réalité imaginée du futur. Cette situation est commune au dessin et à la poésie. La poésie raconte des faits de la vie qu'il pourrait être. Le dessin raconte des faits de la construction de ces formes possibles de l'avenir, du futur. Les scientifiques également trouvent des formules pour les vraisemblables. Pour résumer, l'imagination est une attitude nécessaire à l'artiste. La vraisemblance est une condition de l'œuvre, pas nécessaire, pas suffisante, mais accessoire. C'est l'art abstrait, c'est la grande question, qui est une grande partie de l'art contemporain aujourd'hui. L'art abstrait n'est pas obligé de transmettre des messages crédibles, ce n'est pas dans sa mission. Elle ne traite pas des questions pratiques, l'art abstrait. Par contre, l'architecture, par sa nature matérielle et sociale, peut ne pas plaisir, mais c'est comme ça, doit communiquer promesse du réel, d'une manière crédible, telle que la science, tout comme la science, parce que l'architecture, par sa nature, et sa définition de Vitruvio, est aussi en science. Mais quelle est la mission du scientifique? Une bonne question. Je paraphrase l'encyclopédie. La mission est d'observer les phénomènes, comprendre les causes, imaginer les effets, rédiger des lois et aussi prédire des conséquences. Ça, c'est, je pense, la plus belle page de typographie de l'histoire de la typographie. L'infini, il siderus nuncio di Galilée, qui semble sortir de la page du livre pour rejoindre l'infini. Encore, le scientifique doit opérer avec rigueur, exigence, objectivité. C'est un peu comme l'astrologue, le scientifique. Donc, la mission générique du scientifique n'est pas si différente que la mission de l'architecte. À mon avis, les scientifiques et l'architecte n'ont pas besoin d'un artiste. Ils doivent être un petit peu des artistes. C'est absurde cette idée que l'architecte a besoin d'un artiste pour représenter ses architectures. L'architecte doit être un peu peintre et un peu mathématicien, probablement comme Galiléo, pour illustrer l'effet qu'elle peut prophétiser avec les yeux de l'esprit encore. Je ne comprends pas Je ne tolérais pas, probablement, les poètes qui font écrire les poèmes par d'autres. C'est un peu la manie du ghostwriter des politiciens. Également, je ne comprends pas du tout, je ne comprends pas vraiment les architectes qui sont incapables de représenter leur architecture. Je voudrais lancer une guerre sainte contre les maquettistes et contre les boîtes chinoises du rendering qui travaillent la nuit pour produire, pour reproduire, pour faire les travaux des architectes. Je ne sais pas s'ils ne sont pas capables de faire, ou le marché quotidien est tellement devenu fou que la figuration des propres pensées est faite dehors de sa petite boîte artisanale de l'architecte. Les scientifiques ont donné forme graphique pendant les millénaires à leur découverte, comme a fait Cartesio, comme a fait Descartes, excusez-moi, comme a fait Galiléo. Sans une forme graphique, les découvertes ne seront pas diffusées, jamais diffusées. Les architectes ont raconté leur vision à travers la perspective et la peinture. La transposition de l'architecture de l'empathie aristotelienne, je peux dire la peinture et la perspective. La personnification, entrer dans les romans, c'est personnifier directement dans la tragédie. La sympathie de la tragédie, a dit Aristote. C'est la perspective des architectes. En réalité, très peu d'architectes pouvaient se permettre de payer des peintres à l'époque. Ça a été une grande question. Ou on n'est pas capable de maîtriser bien, comme naturellement a demandé Alberti, la peinture. Schinkel ou Sir Johnson, entre les autres, ne peignent pas personnellement, mais on était des bons peintres, on était des bons dessineurs. Il y a beaucoup de très belles dessins de Swann, soit de Son, soit de Schinkel. Mais il était en symbiose, presque en symbiose physique avec leurs peintres de vues architecturales, Gandhi ou Gärtner. Où sont-nous? OK. Je suis arrivé à l'EPFL, donc. Quand je suis arrivé, j'ai trouvé un nom et un acronyme. Il était me demandé de trouver un nom et un acronyme suggestif le plus possible au laboratoire. Je devais résumer la mission du laboratoire en bref, dans quelques mots simplement. La mission inquiétait les processus de représentation de la pensée scientifique à travers les moyens de l'art, j'ai écrit le premier jour. Mission et nom peu courante, pas facile, ou le nom Laboratoire des arts pour les sciences, aussi pas fluide, ou l'acronyme même inexact de LAPIS. LAPIS s'occupe des beaux-arts, numériques et manuels, dans les domaines scientifiques. Cette école polytechnique, je déteste les mots techniques, je préfère plus science, mais c'est comme ça, il y a 300 années. Et l'architecture, l'architecture, je la considère une discipline scientifique en plein règle. Dans l'histoire de la science, les arts expressifs ont accompagné toutes les études, recherches, découvertes, projets, et ont donné forme et figure à l'invisible, à partir du moment où les concepts et les idées ont acquis une consistance tangible. Dans l'enseignement, je m'occupe simplement des dessins d'architecture, de demander aux étudiants d'apprendre à dessiner l'architecture. Un mot aujourd'hui oublié ou néglecté, qui arrive en français directement dans l'italien. En latin, designare, marqué d'un signe. In hoc signo vinces, pas jamais oublié. Signo de langue européenne, sac, dire, montrer. Par conséquent, je m'occupe des représentations graphiques, physiques, d'une idée d'architecture. Selon les principes de Platon, le dessin est la figuration de la représentation que nous avons dans la tête. Mon enseignement fonctionne en deux directions opposées complémentaires, l'expression figurative et la réduction abstraite. J'ai tracé les sentiers d'apprentissage depuis le début de première année des étudiants jusqu'à master, comme si elle était une ascension du monde analogue de René Dumal, comme une ascension du monde des conventions techniques vers le monde de la liberté et d'expression, donc vers les visions oniriques et sublimes de l'artiste d'avant à l'intuition architecturale. Je pourrais dire aussi que si l'architecture est une discipline qui a un composant scientifique, donc technique, consciente, et un composant poétique, donc artistique, consciente, alors je cherche d'accompagner les étudiants vers le passage d'une à l'autre et vice-versa, grâce et seulement grâce à un travail de réflexion théorique. Je crois fortement que la composante intellectuelle de l'architecture soit un des composants fondamentaux. À la deuxième année du bachelor, les étudiants apprennent les techniques de relevé architectural, apprennent à observer, mesurer, dessiner les bâtiments vernaculaires. Ils apprennent les conventions et l'abstraction technique, la foi des lignes noires. À la troisième année, les étudiants sont plongés dans un tableau des Altemeister, des Oldmeister, un Antonello da Messina ou un Vermeer. Cette année, j'arriverai aussi probablement à Edward Hopper et David Hockney. Dans ce tableau, ils se perdent et ils récompensent les histoires possibles. Ils cherchent de les narrer à travers une construction de nouvelles images. La perspective et le cadrage, la lumière et l'ombre, les couleurs et la focale sont les sujets des cours de la troisième année. Finalement, les étudiants ont la possibilité d'arriver au master, où les cours mon cours a une dénomination vraiment ambitieuse, vision et utopie, où l'acronyme VETU est encore mieux, un peu comme vétuste. Enfin, les étudiants au master inventent et composent leur propre narration. Je les plonge dans des histoires anciennes, des archétypes, des merveilles, des prototypes de l'architecture, de l'aventure humaine, de l'arche de Noé jusqu'à les machines habitées, du paradis perdu aux mégastructures. Ils construisent des visions vraisemblables, et comme dit Aristote, mon mode d'enseignement, les poètes préfèrent sans doute l'impossibilité probable à la possibilité improbable. Les illustrations qui suivent d'ici à la fin sont certains travaux que je ne commenterai pas. Je continuerai un peu les cours, comme ça, mais vous avez la possibilité de voir des images. Ce sont des travaux personnels d'artistes indépendants, des travaux professionnels d'architectes aussi, pourquoi pas non, et des travaux didactiques des étudiants. Certains sont des cartes postales, c'est ma passion. D'autres sont des peintures numériques, réalisées selon les techniques anciennes de la composition. Les deux catégories sont en tout cas des travaux de contrefaction. Je ne pense pas d'être un criminel. Je déclare la falsification comme forme d'art tous les jours. Moi, plus que tout, je me sens un résistant aristotélicien, un artiste qui fait de la vraisemblable sa dimension expressive. J'ai des collections incroyables de cartes postales vraies. J'ai 25 000 cartes postales physiques ou numérisées. Sont tout cataloguées, sont tout mis là, je l'utilise, je les scanne, je les copie un sur l'autre. J'ai commencé à l'époque que quand j'ai oublié d'envoyer à ma grand-mère la carte postale, elle a sponsorisé la vacance. Et alors j'ai inventé un tampon postal, j'ai inventé le tampon et j'ai fait un peu, je l'ai porté à la maison. Et j'ai continué comme ça. Maintenant, j'ai produit des cartes postales et je les produis toujours. Bien, je voudrais revenir à l'apis. L'apis, c'est un nom latin. C'est le nom latin du crayon. Ou mieux, le nom du bas Moyen-Âge, de la Renaissance du crayon. Dit Paul Valéry. Il y a une énorme différence entre voir une chose sans un crayon à la main et le voir en la dessinant. Aristote et les anciens avaient en réalité pas de crayons. Aristote et les anciens n'utilisaient pas de crayons. À l'époque, c'était un graphène. Les anciens romains dessinaient avec le stylus, un bel nom de style. Style d'écriture, dit Roland Barthes. Stylus a été assonné à tort, avec aussi les Grecs anciens de stylos, stylos, la colonne, à tort. Les Grecs écrivant avec les graphos, qui étaient des baguettes pointues. Les graphos viennent tous les suffixes que nous utilisons dans la gravure, mais aussi la photographie ou l'échographie, ou la cinématographie. Le verbe grec graphei veut dire à la fois écrire et peindre, dessiner. Le sens premier est de faire des entailles, de graver des caractères. À l'origine des nombreuses écritures, il y a une double dimension visuelle et textuelle. Donc, et ça vient de la définition elle-même, comme dans les hiéroglyphes. Dans l'art contemporain, souvent, les images sont intriquées, entrelacées entre texte et collage. Dans notre culture moderne, les images sont opposées à l'écriture. Elles sont des non-textes, on peut dire. Et les narrations semblent être apanage exclusif de la littérature, sauf Bob Dylan, qui a finalement gagné le prix Nobel. Le terme anglais du Moyen-Âge, depiction, qui traduit littéralement le latin figurare, vient du latin ancien, depictionem, utilisé soit en littérature, soit dans les arts expressifs pour définir la narration détaillée. Très efficace est l'expression l'adage ut pictura poiesis, comme la peinture, la poésie, tirée d'un vers de l'art poétique d'Horace. Graphène, passé du grec au latin avec expressio, extraire en pressant, c'est encore là, qui décrit bien le travail du stylos qui enlève la cire du tablette, ou le bourron qui enlève les bois du tablette aussi, des bois ou encore le cuivre dans l'art de la gravure. On trouve le radical pressio tendu à l'expression de la pensée, d'où prendre position, énoncer. La peinture n'est pas faite pour décorer des appartements. C'est un instrument de guerre offensive et défensive contre l'ennemi, dit Pablo Picasso dans une lettre du 24 mars 1943 en pleine guerre. Il est plus tard d'ajouter l'ennemi de l'art est le bon goût. On peut dire pentue plus que l'épée. Mon arrière-grand-père maternel, le musicien Ferruccio Busoni, a écrit pendant son exil à Zurich, 1916, un essai d'architecture. Ferruccio était un graphomane. Je voudrais faire la distinction entre deux espèces d'expression architecturale, elle dit. Tout d'abord, les bâtiments expriment les buts pour lesquels il est dessiné. En second lieu, il rayonne une expression par rapport à l'âme humaine. Il est une phrase très belle parce qu'elle a été dit par un musicien aussi qui a passé toute sa vie à traduire Bach pour piano. Et l'expression des données à la partition musicale, Busoni la connaît bien. Ferruccio avait l'ambition d'architecte. Il a fréquenté tous les cercles radicaux du Berlin, où il est mort dans les années 20. Il était un type excentrique. Il a construit dans sa ville natale à Empoli une grande baignoire, une petite piscine, revêtue complètement de lapis lazuli. Et lapis revient aussi. Donc, nous sommes revenus à lapis. Il est un homme précieux, une pierre rare, dure, de la belle couleur d'un bleu profond. Lapis également un homme parfait pour un laboratoire d'expression artistique radicale, j'ai pensé à l'époque. Il se prête à des malentendus outrageants, scandaleuses, homophonie dangereuse, je peux dire, ou téléphone surtout, c'est très difficile, mes assistantes détestent utiliser les noms. J'ai déjà montré Marcel Duchamp là. En 2012-2013, quand j'ai rencontré pour ma première et dernière fois Monsieur le Président Bicher pour mon entretien de recrutement, je lui ai amené comme cadeau un livre, un faux vrai livret, en réalité quelques kilos de livrets, qui était en fait un tome complètement autoproduit par moi, un artefact à la main, imprimé et relié à la maison. À l'intérieur, il y a été des interviews surréalistes. J'ai fait l'interview à moi-même. Nombreuses fausses cartes postales, quelques photos de discutibles expositions, beaucoup de contrefactions. Je l'ai déclaré. Les titres étaient Vrai, fake, wahrscheinlich, les mêmes plus ou moins de le cours d'aujourd'hui. À l'époque, j'avais déjà publié plusieurs ouvrages scientifiques, des vrais livres publiés. Mais aucun ne pouvait narrer mon histoire personnelle de façon autonome. Aucun ne pouvait énoncer mon point de vue de façon indépendante. Aucun a eu cette garantie d'autonomie que donne la vraisemblance. Seulement en recourant à cette narration vraisemblante, je pourrais convaincre Bicher à m'engager. Bicher était aussi une fille d'artiste. Ça, c'était probablement la vraie raison. Alors, je me suis joint à l'EPFL comme artiste avec un titre scientifique autoproduit. Mais pas du tout faux, pas du tout plagiat. J'ai fanfaronné rien. Absolument rien. Le livret est complètement original. Plus original que beaucoup de titres scientifiques, si original qu'il y a seulement 3 copies. De 7 titres, il y a 3 copies, j'ai fait. On était chez moi encore. La deuxième, je ne sais pas si chez Lou Cortelli ou Roberto Gargiani. Et la troisième, je pense, dans la déchetterie de l'ancienne présidence. Reste. Donc, j'étais appelé par Bicher et Gargiani et l'EPFL pour enseigner la communication. Chair of Communication, la dénomination officielle. Communication signifie tout et rien. Un beau sens avec beaucoup de malentendus. Communiquer littéralement signifie mettre en commun. Accomplir leur devoir avec les autres. Même terrible la racine du communisme. Hein? Communiquer est une responsabilité sociale. Un social commitment. Je préfère parler de transmission du savoir. Pour nous, les architectes, est transmission visuelle plus que verbale, de la forme construite ou à construire dans l'avenir. Dans les mots transmission, manque le com, ensemble de communication. Mais il y a l'étymon de transmettre, envoyer au-delà, trahir, traduire. Et la tradition, c'est que le tradiment, et c'est le tradere, c'est transmettre quelque chose. Mais l'architecture, elle est même un moyen de communication, ou média, on dit, le latin, mal traduit en anglais, ou l'anglais mal remporté à l'arrière en latin. Fausse, mais vraisemblable. Maintenant, je donne la deuxième lecture pour terminer. Cette fois-ci, est en latin. J'ai pris une belle traduction, aussi une belle traduction des années 60, corrigée sous la traduction officielle du XVIIe siècle. Attention à la traduction du XIXe siècle qui traduit quod significant et quod significatur, en qui représente et qui représentait. Jean Martin, dans le VIe siècle, a traduit littéralement avec signifiant et significat. Près de 2000 ans, avant Fernand de Saussure, Vitruve déchiffre que l'objet et le sujet sont des entités distinctes, différentes, aussi dans l'architecture. Vitruve nous montre une interprétation structuraliste de l'architecture. Significat et signifiante explique en profondeur la définition de l'architecture et l'art de bâtir, ou de bastir, comme a écrit Jean Martin. Vitruve n'a jamais décliné le concept de manière si directe. La construction, l'artefact, est quod significatur. L'idée d'architecture est quod significat. Mais quod significat est aussi le langage expressif. Bien, la chose se complique. L'architecture est un art, selon Vitruve, attendu comme discipline idéative qui s'efforce de réaliser des choses concrètes. L'architecture est construction avec conscience des formes, on peut dire. Conscience, c'est très difficile à traduire en français. C'est un peu, en même temps, le mindfulness, l'awareness et l'italien consapevolezza. En italien, il y a consapevolezza et coscienza qui sont des choses différentes. Mais nous ne sommes pas très machinistes et laïques comme les Français. Nous avons une version plus morale et une version plus pratique. L'architecture transforme l'action constructive en significat, si je prends Vitruve. Donc, l'architecte communique un message à travers la définition d'une forme. L'homme utilise le langage. Barthes dirait le style de l'architecture pour exprimer un contenu autre que les nécessités primaires de la survivance. La construction de la cabane d'Adam. La construction, c'est le contenant, la nécessité pour Aristote. Par contre, le contenu autre n'est pas nécessaire. Le contenu autre, c'est un besoin induit de l'aspiration personnelle et collective de communication de l'homme, de communiquer à travers l'architecture. La construction, c'est l'état de nécessité. Le message de l'architecture, c'est quelque chose d'ajouté. Pour définir les concepts d'art, je reste dans le champ aristotélien et j'utilise une définition de René Dumal. Art est appelé ici la réalisation d'une connaissance en action. Et une définition très classique. C'est la définition des techniques anciennes, non de la technique moderne. Art de bastir, avec la S, dit encore Jean Martin, dans sa première traduction en français. Et exactement le binôme Bau-Kunst, où Bau, c'est le métier, l'exis, et le Kunst, c'est l'ars, la technique. Le grand malentendu que l'art, c'est la traduction latine de la technique grecque, et perduré jusqu'à aujourd'hui. C'est le métier, c'est l'exis, la facilitas, la facility en anglais qui est resté. La technique, c'est un peu le know-how, c'est le savoir-faire, avec une idée et une organisation créative. C'est moins compliqué que la traduction des pestemés utilisée plus tard. Bien. De nouveau, nous devons retourner à Vitruve. L'architecture comme métier, l'exis, est une activité mécanique, dont le but est pratique et matériel. L'architecture comme art, la technique, est une activité intellectuelle, libérale et poétique, qui donne signification et sens à son œuvre, ou bien transmet un contenu autre. L'architecture comme science, épistémée, n'est pas une activité, est une forme de connaissance complète. Je peux dire aussi, vive l'épistémée. Maintenant, finalement, je vais mettre Vitruve d'Aristote pour obtenir un court-circuit. Selon Vitruve, est l'artiste de la construction, l'architecte, qui compose avec sens les éléments. Et selon Aristote, l'architecte, en tant qu'artiste, doit imiter la nature. Ceci, c'est un grand problème. Il n'y a rien à imiter dans la nature pour les architectes. Alors arrive la poétique d'Aristote, peut imiter à travers analogie, bien sûr, et vraisemblance. Avec l'analogie, l'homme imite les proportions de la nature. Avec la vraisemblance, peut imiter les processus constructifs. Et ça, la tectonique, l'idée de la construction, ou mieux, la représentation vraisemblable de l'idée constructive. J'appliquais littéralement la poétique aristotélicienne à l'art de la construction vitruvienne. Dans l'architecture, l'objet représenté est donc la construction. Le design est un moyen pour rendre cette représentation autonome, avec sa force expressive, exactement comme la tragédie. La représentation est le savoir voir pour Aristote, l'avoir conscience de voir. Rendre présente de nouveau est la fantasia que Platon définit encore mieux. La représentation, donc, est la perception consciente d'une entité. La représentation se réfère à la sphère perceptive et idéative, et la figuration, alors, qui se réfère à la sphère concrète et tangible. La représentation graphique, à la fin, est la figuration. Ce passage du monde des idées au monde des signes, en architecture, reste à mi-chemin entre le réel et l'imaginaire. C'est le limbe du vraisemblable. Les racines de figura et fingo sont les mêmes, mais aussi de fiction. Donc la fiction arrive d'avoir la même racine de la figura. La figura est donc l'image de la forme. La figuration peut être utile à la transmission de l'architecture à travers ces deux passages de vraisemblance et d'analogie avec les choses sensibles déjà connues. J'ai cité une dernière fois Aristote, mais maintenant je dois fermer le cercle, boucler la boucle, on dit. L'architecture, donc, n'est pas une technique. Si je prends à la lettre le passage de Vitruve à travers Léon Battista Alberti pour arriver à Aristote arrière. Pour ma opinion personnelle, l'architecture est une science inexacte, faible et fragile. Sa condition naturelle est de représenter une forme future qui n'existe pas encore à travers une figuration vraisemblable et nécessaire. Les bonnes images d'architecture sont des objets qui appartiennent au monde qui n'est pas seulement réel et quotidien, mais aussi sont des visions et des souvenirs. Les bonnes images d'architecture rencontrent et font rêver. Les bonnes images d'architecture entretiennent des relations avec des univers sentimentaux longtemps, passé et futur. Dans quelque manière, les bonnes images d'architecture choisissent des référentes avec aussi des amis épistolaires. Pour cette raison, j'aime beaucoup les cartes postales, qui ont ce double sens. L'image d'un côté et l'image arrière fait avec l'écriture, un message personnel et un message public. Tout le monde les peut lire, mais les peut lire à travers des filtres. Dans quelque manière, donc, les bonnes images d'architecture choisissent des référents, des amis épistolaires avec qui échanger des messages, envoyer des salutations et dans ce monde vraisemblable, se sentir moins seul. Je vous remercie.
comme c'est de la coutume pour les leçons inaugurales, j'invite l'audience à assaillir Nicolas de questions. Est-ce qu'il y a des questions de la part de l'audience? Si, il doit y en avoir.
Oh, my God.
Roberto, usual suspects. Non?
J'ai fait un cours trop sérieux.
Tu as été stunning. Pas de questions vraiment? Eh bien alors, je te remercie encore une fois, Nicolas.
À toi, merci.
Nicolas, un grand merci pour cette leçon inaugurale et de nous avoir emmenés dans le monde à la fois de l'imaginaire, du réel, du construit et du non construit. Je vais maintenant passer à l'introduction du professeur Paolo Tombesi et donc à passer à sa deuxième langue, comme je l'ai dit, l'anglais. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, it is a great pleasure for me to introduce the inaugural lesson of Professor Paolo Tombesi. It's a difficult task when presenting a personality like Paolo to know where to start, having a personality that has been going throughout the world with a career rich in many highlights and many turns. So he is, for now, established international authority, often consulted by governmental bodies on the industrial organization of architectural practice and the analysis of the building procurement process. He employs industrial economics, labor theory, and regional development models to examine the relationship between design, technological innovation, knowledge production, and building markets. He focuses on the relationship between the intellectual dimension of architecture and the socio-technical aspects of physical construction. To get there, he first was trained as an architect in Italy and obtained his B.Arch from the University of Rome La Sapienza in 1990. A former Fulbright Fellow, he did his PhD at UCLA in Los Angeles, which he completed in 1997 on the distribution of technical design knowledge in the building industry developed by examining the construction of Frank Gehry's buildings. After that, he joined the University of Melbourne a first time. From 2005 to 2009, he was there as Italian Government Research Fellow at the Faculty of Architecture of the Polytechnic of Turin as part of the Brain Return program designed to build new research capacity in Italy, so coming back. During this period, he also worked on the World Heritage Listing nomination of the Sydney Opera House to UNESCO in 2006. Back to the University of Melbourne in 2009, he was appointed for the chair of construction. He also held visiting positions at the University of Reading in England, at the University of Minnesota, and at ENAC, at EPFL, during a 6-month sabbatical that he did in 2012. Therefore, he was a known face to us, to EPFL and to ENAC, and ENAC was not new to him when he started in September of 2016 as full professor of construction and architecture. What was maybe new for him, though, was that he joined one of our satellite campuses, the EPFL Fribourg campus, and its Smart Living Lab, so as to strengthen EPFL's activities over there in the fields of technology, construction, and sustainable architecture. I would like to go through just a selection of his awards and distinctions, such as in 1998, the Italian National Research Council Award for Quality of Research. In 2000, the Journal of Architectural Education Award for an Outstanding Article. In 2005, the Cicellation Prize, which is a research prize from the Royal Australian Institute of Architects, and the resulting book, Looking Ahead, Defining the Terms of a Sustainable Architectural Profession, that was published in 2007. And in 2009, the Knowledge Transfer Excellence Award from the University of Melbourne. He also contributed to the Global Holcim Awards Silver 2015 winning project called Post-War Collective, Community Library and Social Recuperation, in Ambepusa in Sri Lanka by Melinda Patiraya, Ganga Ratnayake, and the team from Robust Architecture Workshop in Sri Lanka. Sorry about the misspelling. Recently, he has been involved in the activities of the Building Intelligence Project at Columbia University, the CBIP, and with the professional and academic scene in Sri Lanka. He ambitions to develop his collaboration with international NGOs for the reconstruction in some countries devastated by natural disasters. His work has also appeared in many journals, including but not restricted to Architectural Research Quarterly, Casabella, Center, Construire, Domus, Harvard Design Magazine, Spazio and Società, and UME. In conclusion, before I leave him the floor, I would like to thank him warmly, first of all, to have joined us at EPFL in September, but also for having accepted to take the charge of Institute Director as of April 1st, which is in a few days and is not anything to joke about. So thank you very much, Paolo, and the floor is yours.
Il n'est pas fermé. Non, non, non. Il faut fermer.
Oh, I can actually put it in there.
No, no, no. I think it's better. You have the...
Okay, well, I can. You have to put it here.
You haven't? Ah, yes. C'est pas la même.
You follow me?
Non.
Okay, well, I'll do with this one. Okay. Now please all close your eyes, because otherwise terrible things will appear on the screen.
On voit rien. We see nothing. It's okay.
That's all right.
Maybe it's better if you put on.
Yeah, sure.
Non, c'est bon, c'est bon.
C'est bon.
Sauf que you are on the
D'accord.
key.
Well, thanks for being so patient, and thanks for having agreed to be stood up 2 or 3 weeks ago when I was supposed to give my lecture, but unfortunately, due to personal circumstances, namely flu, I had to postpone, and I have to thank publicly Professor Paola Vigonò for offering to give me her slot in this calendar of inaugural lectures in order for me to be able to perform before you today. And the reason why it was important is because I wanted to give this lecture in March, not after March, but within March. And the reason why I wanted to give it in March is because this month my grandmother would have turned 100 years old. Leopoldo Bolgora Ciambecchini, also known as Boldina. And I'm actually showing this photograph not to simply celebrate her, but because I think it will help me in the argument that I would like to build. As you can see, a woman of arresting beauty, of limited schooling, given that she was born in 1917, as many women of her generation, and uncanny world wisdom. So what happened at the end of the World War II is that she elected, for personal circumstances, to raise her children as a single mother. My mother, who's here today, and my uncle. And so single motherhood brings financial responsibilities. And so in the 1950s, she decided to join the workforce as part of a small company that produced supplies for local governments, infrastructural work. And then eventually she decided to go on her own, and she established a small company that started to serve local government and small organizations, essentially in the industrializing south of Italy, by supplying materials and components for road construction and small infrastructural work. That is something that gave her economic independence and made it possible for her to raise her children, give them a future, and eventually create the conditions for me to go to university and essentially stand before you today. So the reason I'm putting it there is because I am the living proof through her of something that economists call the economic multiplier of an industrial sector. That is the ability of a particular sector to multiply the resources that go into another sector by creating agglomerated demand. Where I live in Australia, each additional dollar in construction produces $3 additional in the economy. In Italy at the moment, I think it's below 2, but at the time my grandmother joined the workforce would have been over 3. So essentially she worked in the Australia of the time. Today, around the world, the International Labour Organization esteems that the economic multiplier of construction is on average between 3.4 and 3.6 in the last 15 years. But in this average, low-income economies are not counted. And they're not counted because it is very, very difficult to actually understand the dynamics, the structure of construction in places that are not well structured from an administrative point of view, where most of construction activity is not actually formal. Having said that, being part of a construction sector that produces wealth doesn't mean that everyone gets access to that wealth in the same way. And this has to do with what is called the quality of supply chains. That is the way in which we configure our production processes and our industrial organization in such a way as to allocate resources to particular tasks, particular technologies, and make sure that those that contribute to that supply chain benefit from that particular organization. So it's not simply about the wealth that construction generates, but it's also the way in which it generates it and the way in which the generators of that wealth get livable, decent working conditions. And then takes me to the second reason as to why I wanted to give this lecture in March, and serendipitously even better today. And it has to do with the 8th of March, that most of us know as the International Women's Day. Now, if it was just the International Women's Day, possibly I would not have included that in this particular lecture. But you all know that the 8th of March stands there to signify a particular event in our history. The official date, the 8th of March, of course, marks the day in which the Socialist League of Russian women marched in Petrograd to start the Russian Revolution. But the date that we use today is a conventional one, because what we celebrate is the work movement that started as a result of something that took place 2 days ago, 106 years ago. And that event was the fire that burned down the Triangle Waste Factory in New York City, in Washington Square, right next to one of the most venerable academic institutions, New York University. In fact, today, this building is part of New York University. 106 years ago, it was a sweatshop in Washington Square. On that day, 25th of March, 1911, 146 women and young girls mainly from Italy, recent migrants from Italy and Poland, aged between 14 and 28, found at death because of what happened in this particular building that had not followed building regulations, did not have proper fire escapes, did not have enough water pressures in the mains, and therefore left all these people with the only chance to jump off the windows to a certain death. As a result of that, major workplace legislation and essentially building regulations were put in place in New York, and the entire movement started to gain momentum. So much so that that day today is still remembered within New York University campus and through some activists, a particular one by the name of, who I tend to forget the name, Ruth Sergel, that in 2004 started this particular project whereby event goers go through Manhattan and retrace where these people live. And write down in chalk on the curb of the road where they lived and how young or old they were when they died. Last year, or a few years ago, in 2011, in time for the centennial anniversary of the tragedy, which, by the way, is the worst building disaster in New York before the collapse of the Twin Towers. So on that day, there was another writing that appeared on the sidewalk and at a different place and a different date. December 10th, 2010, Bangladesh. And that is something that relates to another fire that broke out exactly in the same condition in Bangladesh. It was a sweatshop factory making shirts for women in Hashulia, near Dhaka, and it was a factory that was producing garments for Gap. And 3,000 women died almost exactly in the same condition, 100 years after the same disaster in New York City, in a place which today is one of the highest land values in the world. And it didn't finish there, because a year later, a similar fire was produced that killed 110 women, essentially in the same district. But the photograph that you see on the right is neither one of those two fires, but is the far worst one that happened in Savar, still near Dhaka. It was a Rana Plaza factory with 8,000 people worked, and 1,100 of them died because of the collapse of a structure that was dodgily built and did not respect some of the particularly loose normatives. So the reason why I put these images here is because anytime we consider the ability, the possible contribution of construction to development, at the same time, we also need to consider how to develop a construction fabric which is up to the task of a changing world of a higher density of different type of requirements. So my challenge over the last few years, as Dean Anderson mentioned, has been that of understanding how to frame this, how to build a narrative, how to be able to communicate the necessity of looking into this whilst being clear and convincing. And I have grown up with this particular sentence that was my grandmother's preferred sentence. She was open to everything, anything in fact, but she wanted to know what that thing meant. So I had to explain to her anytime we went to a museum or to a movie or to a piece of artwork what that thing was about. And I decided that was a very good training at university in order to make sure that even the most difficult things could be communicated efficiently. And as a result of that, I end up developing my own Kuldina method. So for the last 20, 25 years at university, I always asked both myself and the students what either my grandmother or their grandmother would have said about a particular position, a particular project, a particular argument. So I'm going to use the Poldina method in order to open up a window into the way in which I work. Essentially, it's a window of unabashed sincerity for the moment, to see how one can tackle those type of issues, which I consider particularly difficult. So what is construction from this point of view? So according to my method, and going through construction scholarship that was developed essentially from 1960 to 2000, those are the 40 years that are critical, there are 6 elements that characterize construction as an industry. The first thing is it a large-scale transformative industry, in a sense that it uses the output of other industry, particularly manufacturing, to make sense of another object that would not have existed before. Because of this, it is the only industry that connects markets, namely manufacturing on this side and real estate, land distribution on the other. So it bridges 2 major components of the economy. Because of its connection with manufacturing, it is also an ever-changing industry because it is naturally subject to the rate of innovation or technological evolution that exists in manufacturing. Even though it's naturally open to innovation, it doesn't produce innovation that often because it's inertia-laden. And it is inertia-laden because it is the ultimate example of durable goods. So goods that can actually last a long time before deteriorating, like fridges, TVs, cars. A building is the ultimate form of durable good, which means that people are not exposed to other possibilities in buildings in that lifetime, and because they're very durable and very big, it is very expensive to take that risk. Because of this, most of innovation in building takes the form of marginal product substitution. So we don't substitute the entire thing, but we take one piece off and replace it with something else. That means the change in building can never be total. And the last thing is that it's a competing benefits industry, because given that many people contribute to this sector, and each contribution is defined by particular thresholds of economies of scale and economies of scope, what makes sense to me in one position of the cycle may not make sense to other people that inhabit the same cycle in a different position. Now, having said that, I always feel the need to sort of make a diagram, which is certainly not as sophisticated as Professor Braghieri's diagram, but after all, I'm in with the Poldina method. And so essentially you see construction as a grey box which is contained between manufacturing and real estate, and is defined by 3 different types of production. Volume production in manufacturing, batch production in construction, because it is a project-based industry, and mass consumption done through individual consumers in real estate. So we have suppliers that contribute to construction, producers that are the ones inside the box, and users that are the ones that are the ultimate beneficiaries of that product. The producers select who comes in and either push that product outside, or they are subject to a process of selection if the user, the buyer, has capital power. In doing this, you have 2 particular strands of activity. The one to the left, market suppliers and market buyers. So manufacturers supply the market of construction, and construction people buy from the market of manufacturing. And in return, producers in construction sell to the real estate, and the real estate market buys from production. Depending on how much financial strength you have, you can decide to behave in 2 different ways. Either by buying what the market offers you, or by putting pressure, exerting pressure on the market of manufacturing or the market of building, so that they can make what you think will satisfy your needs. So it is an interesting industry that works as a push and pull dynamic model. It is one of the very few industries in the economy that does it. Now suppose that we were so shrewd as to channel all this energy, all this sort of stream of activities into something, a cogwheel of the construction industry that by extension becomes a cogwheel of the economy. And I think this is an interesting proposition, and it is a very valid one, because if the design component of the industry could actually take moves that will have major repercussions uphill and downhill, the entire economy would benefit from it. So, let's get into the detail of the cast, and I'll borrow that from innovation theory. Although I'm not presenting any references, from 1960 exactly onwards, innovation theory says that you can actually change a building product in 4 ways. By focusing on form, space, volume, by focusing on the processes of construction, by focusing on the component parts of a building, or by focusing on the features of the performance of the building, of the materials, of the process, and so forth. Now, what's interesting in the industry is that the best possible way of working within it is by putting the project at the center and make sure that it maximizes the potential which is offered in each one of those sectors. But that rarely happens because, in fact, there is a social division of labor in the industry. And there are particular social blocks that are in control of those particular 4 functions. So you would say that the professional world is in control of form and volume. The executors, so the building component, is in control of processes. Either scientists or users are in control of performance, of the parameters of the building, and certainly suppliers, the manufacturing component, is in charge of the componentry. So if we look at this within the framework that I just described of the industry and the push and pull dynamics, we could actually see that there is a number of, or we could hypothesize that there is a number of axes in the industry, that depending on where we are, what sort of market we work with, what sort of financial capacity we have, we can either push or pull for particular products to enter the design and construction arena. This is certainly the case with particular building markets, so it's different to actually design a volume housing than it is to design a theatre, to design a residential palace, as opposed to designing a clinic, because the social blocks that are in control of the knowledge and the capital differ and have different interests. But this can also be applied to the sort of zeitgeist that exists in the world that we inhabit. And so, for instance, we could look at this as a way of filtering institutional inclinations towards the built environment. So I've only been here for a few months, but any time I take the train, get off the train and walk across the bridge, I can't help not to notice that these 3 buildings essentially reflect a different relationship between design and industry. The one on the left, of course, is a building that exudes proposition, leadership. The one in the center is a one that shows cultivated acquiescence with the industry. And the other one to the right certainly suggests a modicum of subordination in relation to the component industry. Now, this is not a major problem in Switzerland or in any advanced economy for that matter, because once an industry becomes mature, the focus tends to be on building features. In a sense that the industry is already developed, building componentry is available, building processes have been optimized. So what we do, we tend to change things in relation to how we would like them to work. We can improve on them, we can make them better, we can find new permutations. And it's a very good position to be in, which is essentially the position of the Smart Living Lab, because you can actually speculate on what different configurations of the same systems may actually bring, with the luxury of trying it because the industry is already there. Now, which quadrant should one focus for development? For developing construction or for focusing on construction as a tool for development. And here the position's different. My position is that one should actually look at the component industry and actually organize one's projects with a strategy aimed at making that particular sector of the economy develop. Because without an industry, you can't, a component industry, a material industry, you can't actually build satisfactory buildings, and you can't build knowledge into the industry. Without that knowledge, you can't undertake R&D. And essentially what I'm saying is that if the design world could actually move from form or instruct form in such a way as to make sense of componentry and make sure that the constraints that belong to the process in a developing industry, so not in a mature industry, could actually be internalized, then you have a sort of a virtuous triangle that is consisting of form, components and features that has the ability and has proved to have the ability, particularly in the 1950s and 60s, to turn around an industry. Now, this is not possibly the only position that one could have. I know that there are people that don't believe in what I say. And so I decided to use this lecture and to take a sort of a case study and see what would happen to that particular building or that particular experience if one applied this particular broadening of the horizon. And I've decided to carry out this exercise by looking at the Drone Port project for a number of reasons, because I think it's a very important project, not only for EPFL, but in general. It's commendable that we're actually trying to take proactive action to solve some of the problems and evennesses of this world. But the other thing is that it actually lines up with some of the work that I have been doing over the last few years, particularly in South America, to try and find an answer not only to my positions, but also to my doubts. So for those of you who don't know about this particular project, is a project developed in collaboration between EPFL through the Institute Future Africa, which has developed a couple of projects that have to do with red line for the transportation of blood vessels across some regions of Africa through the use of drones, which will eventually develop into a blue line, which will carry out parcels that are much larger and heavier than blood satchels, and has been developed in collaboration with the Norman Foster Foundation, with an engineering laboratory at ETH headed by Philippe Bloch, with the collaboration of John Oxendorf at MIT and other laboratories at Cambridge, and has been generously supported by the Olsen Foundation, which for the event at the Venice Biennale, where the prototype was assembled and presented, also organized, manufactured a different type of brick. Now, what is the agenda, the socio-technical agenda, the way I understand it, of the Drone Port project? Certainly, it is an exercise in nation, state, and community building in low-income parts of the world. And it is an exercise which is carried out through the supply of infrastructure that looks after the provision of healthcare and economic development opportunities. In order to do this and maximize the potential, there is a strong reliance on the local resource base, and by extension, that reliance is likely to result in the minimization of carbon emissions. Now, from my own point of view, synthetically, there are a number of things that are worth considering here. The first one is the structural engineering and material innovativeness that has to do with the provision of a thin tile, double curvature wall structure that works in compression without reinforcement. This is what you're seeing here in Venice, which, in order to minimize the false work required and the centering required for the construction of the vault, uses a combination of posts that are tied to flexible fiberglass guides that skilled master masons are ostensibly going to use in order to produce the tile arch with fast-setting plaster. Now, in doing this, clearly there has been a major choice has been made. The one of concentrating the intervention on commodities. So it is a particular project that doesn't use components, but use either, both, raw commodities in the form of clay, cement, fiberglass poles, and raw commodities in terms of labor. So uses materials as well as sweat equity as a strategy to export. The other thing is that in order to do that, everything has been attempted to be made as portable and easy to use and assemble as possible, possibly with the exception of the footings and the footings of the building, of the structure, that due to the splaying effect of the arch needs to be designed and constructed quite carefully. Now, one of the ideas that Norman Foster brought up in 2015 was that such a building could actually be combined modularly, essentially by making a small building. It's not made up of components, it's made of small buildings that go together one after the other. So there is a modular typology, which then is supposed to give rise to a multifunctional shelter, where by changing the parameters of the computational geometry of the shell, one would have different dimensions of spaces that can be used to accommodate different uses that have to do with the drone port itself, with manufacturing facilities for new drones, with public services, as well as a market. So it is one structural component that serves at the same time, with the same form, different programs that may have different technological requirements. And the last one is that it is something that wants to have economic importance and institutional importance. It's something that wants to build iconic recognitions in order to provide identity. So essentially what happens with this particular project is that there is a sacred alliance between form and process in the form of engineering. There is a contribution from the bottom left side, which is research, in the form of the research laboratories at the universities that develop the engineering, as well in the form of the great assistance that Lafarge-Holcim has provided to the materialization of the tiles. Now, what happens with construction and development, though? How does the building, or how does the project contribute to those two terms? If one asked Edwin Heathcote, the architectural critic of the Financial Times, that was the editor for the special issue of L'Architecture aujourd'hui, which was distributed at the Venice Biennale, there is no such issue. This is a project that addresses difficult issues without sacrificing elegance for utility. It is an attempt to harness the improvements in technology for the benefit of the poorest, and is a blend of nascent urbanism, high-tech and low-tech, piece of construction, and an optimistic embodiment of a brighter future. So what I wanted to do was not to look at this, because in fact it's not a project, it's not finished, it's a prototype, and it is an important prototype because it may actually produce the basis for something else, bigger and better. But I wanted to use the context in which this particular project was developed. And according to all the actors active in this particular project, there were at least 3 precedents that could not be ignored. The first one is the construction of the arts school in Cuba that started in 1961 and was suspended in 1965. The other one is the work that Rafael Guastavino Company carried out between the mid-1880s and the late 1960s, in fact the 1930s, because for 30 years the company was not very active. And the third one is the work on double curvature thin vaulted shells that Elavio Dieste worked on in Chile from 1958 to the mid-1990s, but in fact, for the purpose of this talk, between 1970s and 1990s. So, let me take you through some of these places, which are places where I spent lunchtime of last year before joining EPFL. The first one is the National Art School in Havana. That was started the year my grandmother became a grandmother. And it's an interesting project because it was commissioned by Fidel Castro to these young architects on the left, Ricardo Porro, who was born in Havana but had to leave the country in 1957 after the failed coup. And he went to work in Venezuela with Carlos Raúl Villanueva on the Banco Obrero housing project, where he met two guys from Italy, one from Venice, Roberto Gottardi, and another one from Milano, Vittorio Garatti, who joined him in Venezuela. Then in 1960 moved back to Cuba. Fidel Castro asked him to design something that would embody the spirit of a new Cuba. He called his mates to Havana, and the rest is history. Now, Ricardo Porro was a particular type of person. In 1957, before going into exile out of Cuba, he actually wrote this piece, El sentido de la tradición, the feeling of tradition in our time, in which he actually made an affirmation for a black architecture, something that would be much closer to the spirit and the nature of Cuba than the modernist architecture that he'd been working in. And possibly he was not alone in doing this, because as you know, this is the famous murale that Alfonso Siqueiros produced in Mexico City in the Palace of Fine Arts right after the end of the war. It's called The New Democracy, and it's very famous because as part of the New Democracy that sort of lunges out of the space of imprisonment, there is another arm that comes out of the earth, and strength comes out of belonging to one's particular place. So there is no doubt that this was part of the spirit, and in fact, Porro usually referred to his construction, his design for the art school in Cuba, as the breast from which Cubans could actually get to be fed by Cuban culture. So there was a very sort of anthropomorphic dimension to this. Now, they were appointed as architects in 1961. They started to work on the art schools straight away in a regime of almost total autarky. And so they decided to use Catalan vaulting, which is the material of choice here, simply because there was no labor. Otherwise, there was 1-2 masons from Barcelona, from Catalonia, who joined the revolution. They were available, and they were given the task of training 80 other people in order to build the schools. So it was something done out of necessity and cultural alignment, if you will, rather than industrial choice. Now, in 1963, September 1963, Cuba houses the 7th Congress of the International Union of Architects. The first Congress had been here, 1948, in Lausanne, and it's a difficult Congress, because in Paris, Pierre Fagon had decided to award the Congress to Cuba, but it was 1957. Then the revolution took place in 1959. Then the Bay of Pigs happened in 1962. And then the Cuban Missile Crisis took place in 1962. So you can imagine the sort of environment in which these people were organizing the Congress. In fact, no one wanted to organize it. Eventually, the Cubans managed to convince the Americans and the committee of the UIA by saying that all the office meetings will be held in Mexico City, whereas only light cultural meetings would take place in Cuba. But they actually had one particular request, that next to the meeting of the UIA, there should be another meeting, the first international meetings of professors and students of architecture, first and only. And that was the political component of the meeting. And essentially, it was the deal, the bargain that the Cubans managed to get. And who was the closing speaker at this meeting? It was Ernesto Che Guevara, who came in from having just published Guerrilla Warfare. He went into the room in his fatigues, with his guns, with everything, and gave a concluding speech to the professors and the students of architecture from all over the world. And from what I understand, he put his gun onto the table at the end and said, you don't need guns. You've got architecture. And tried to essentially sort of trigger a common enthusiasm and feeling for the emancipatory function, revolutionary function of architecture, if you will, in the construction of a socialist world. The UIA was very upset about this intervention, and so he took Fidel Castro, the concluding section in which he was the closing speaker, to essentially become much more polite and diplomatic, and only provide some criticism about heavy industrialization come from the European East. Now, this is interesting because at the time they were working on those schools, but what Che Guevara said was ominous of times to come, because between 1963 and 1965, Cuba had to decide which position to take and which position to take in economic and technological matters. So the construction of the art school was essentially slowed down, even thanks to the slowness of the production process, because the 80 people were not actually being very productive, and eventually was stopped. Was stopped when Cuba adopted the Communist Party framework. So the month that the Communist Party of Cuba came into existence as the official entity of the nation, the art school work on the art school was stopped because it was too self-indulgent and not enough directed to the efforts of a socialist construction. So this is what the art school was replaced by. A number of attempts in industrialized system that essentially reflected the passage from the magic realism of the school to the socialist realism of the new course of Cuban history. Now, there was another Italian all over the place who, by the name of Roberto Segre, one of the most perceptive historians of South American architecture, migrated to Argentina in 1939 because of racial persecution, and the same year that Castro and Guevara were giving the speech, he actually went to Cuba, I think as a student or as a recent graduate. He fell in love with the revolution and stayed there, and became the shaman, the voice of the revolution from an architectural point of view. And it is this man that between 63 and 65 became the worst enemy of the art schools, because he thought that the message, technological message as well as the political message of the art school was not in sync, in line with the process of socialist construction. And because of that, construction was abandoned. In a few years' time, the schools were completely engulfed by vegetation, particularly the School of Ballet, the School of Dance by Vittorio Garatti, until someone from America, by the name of John Loomis, in 1999, wrote a book which was called Revolution of Forms, Cuba Forgotten Art Schools. And it's interesting because Harvard Design Magazine the same year made the review and said, look, this is really the beginning of an architectural novel. Why was an architectural novel? Because the book took the architectural community by storm. And everyone started to imagine this gilded past in which Cuba was sort of replete with Catalan vaulting structures, whereas in fact there was only one which had never been finished. Nevertheless, they took. The book was actually a boon for the schools, because it took the schools to world to a world audience, and so they became very, very famous. Even the Cuban government decided to restore them. As part of the restoration project, Norman Foster was actually asked to take on the restoration together with, in collaboration with a former very famous ballet dancer from Cuba. Then eventually the funds dried out and the project hasn't been stopped, with major recriminations on the side of the local architectural scene in Cuba, because they didn't think that the project should have been given to a foreign architect, regardless of its cloud position and fame, but rather to one of the architects that was still there. Eventually Foster went back and wrote a book on autos, automobiles and architecture in Havana, where the photographs that I showed you before, that is the ones with the old cars, are actually photographed with these buildings as part of the background. So this is the first thing, something that is of incredible value and imaginative power, but only existed in the minds of some and only for a couple of years. Then we go into the second reference, which is Rafael Guastavino, his family, and the place that they played in the construction of the American institutional fabric for that matter. They migrated from Spain in 1881. To New York from Valencia, and they found a very fertile environment for the use of thin vaulted construction from Spain. America was going through a Renaissance period. Masonry was the material of, masonry image was the material of choice, but most of the work was being built in wood structures. And so the Guastavino actually provided a technology that would enhance the truthfulness of the process in relation to the image. And it was also something very practical, because it didn't need the very heavy centering and false work and hosting that other projects would need, because after all, they were actually using the vaults as false work. And so they actually became much better at producing those projects that traditional construction companies. Was not an architect, was not an engineer, was a builder. It was a family of builders that moved from Spain to New York. And eventually in 1885, they patented the first structural system. In 1889, they patented a particular type of brick that was a 5-proof brick. So it was a component. And America needed that sort of things, because building codes were not enough to decide what, certainly the structural engineering codes, but just the building code in general were not enough to decide what could actually be done with buildings and particular building solutions. So they took the initiative and did it. One of the things that happened with this particular project, the Guastavino brothers essentially developed a monopoly over the construction of institutional buildings in the United States, in the northern part of the United States, by developing a comparative advantage. They were the builders of choice for institutional buildings, and by building one, they would learn more. And so they would actually qualify themselves as even better builders, to such an extent that they had to open up their own factory for tile production, and they started to actually insert their own patterns for fireproof bricks into all the projects. So what you can see is a pamphlet, an advertising pamphlet showing all the domes that the Guastavino brothers had built. Essentially all of New York that you know has been built by this small company of Spanish migrants. And on the other side, all the buildings that had been furnished with the fireproof tiling of the Guastavino brothers. And yet, this only lasted for 40 years, essentially. The one on the left, and by the way, I'm actually using the work of John Oxendorf at MIT, that has done a majestic sort of history of the company in his book, The Art of Structural Tile, published in 2010. Anyway, that diagram there shows the number of tiles that were produced at the Guastavino factory near New York between 1900 and 1960. So you see that right at the onset of World War I, they arrived at producing almost 1 million fireproof tiles to be used throughout New York and America. Then, of course, there is a sharp dip that has to do with the war. There is some major reconstruction in the 20s, and then there is this peak after the Depression, which doesn't go up after the 30s. And it doesn't go up essentially because their material has been replaced. There is steel. And steel essentially replaces the advantage, or takes over the advantages that the Guastavino brothers had with the tile vaulting, because it was easier to erect and it had comparatively less labor and cheaper labor than the direct competitors. And so Guastavino in the 1940s comes out with ads in the newspapers, in the professional journals that says, look, we can actually do the same thing that you're doing in steel, but we can do it with a tile vaulted space. Nevertheless, that didn't produce good results. And in fact, in 1940, they decided to move away from structural construction into decorative patterns. So for 40 years, they had been the builders of New York, and from 1914 onwards, they decided to become the decorators of New York. But by 1960, which is when the art school was being built, Guastavino did not have any more work, and the company closed down in 1962. So this takes to the third one, which is Eladio Dieste in Uruguay. What you can see here is one of the grain silos that was built in Yanga, in the central northern part of Uruguay, as a Gaussian vaulted structure with a double curvature. And it's interesting what the position of this particular professional within the economic landscape of Uruguay. Because essentially we are in this part of the world. And if you look at the position of Eladio Dieste's building, they are positioned along this S, may not be exactly the way it is, that follows the agricultural production ball of Uruguay. So essentially Dieste was producing building typologies according to a technology that was very, very appropriate to the task at hand. There was that of storing materials that would actually exert lateral pressure on the walls. In the process, he actually produced buildings that took part into the institutional construction of the Uruguayan fabric. And so those points, red points, are the points where Guastavino buildings were actually built that were not warehouses, were not storage places, but rather institutional buildings. Now, let me go very quickly through some of the buildings in a slightly different way. I don't have the knowledge, the expertise, or the inclination to examine them structurally. I have my new colleague and friend, Corentin Fivet. This is his specialty, and I'll be more than happy to leave this task to him. In my case, I want to look at the broader environment. So this is one famous project, one of those institutional buildings in one of the small cities, Durazno, and it's a public gymnasium. Still, double curvature, shells incredible effect. Now look at that woman on the floor of the gymnasium, and the reason why that woman is there is this, that the amount of living nature that has come to inhabit that building, as well as all the other buildings, is so overwhelming that the building has to be cleaned every day, and even when they clean it, it can't be used. So this is a building which is very famous. It's one of the two gymnasiums that Eladio Dieste built in Durazno and and Montevideo, but the seating cannot be used. So they can only play in the center, but the rest of it is essentially off limits for environmental reasons. So there is one condition that we tend not to look at, or we tend not to consider when we look at these buildings. And when we make these buildings in particular parts of the world where the fauna is overwhelmingly active, it is possibly something that we might consider. And in fact, in some other buildings by the estate, they had to consider it. So they had to enclose the space and control that environmentally, which of course created the problem of environmental control. And how does a double curvature shell, which is entirely structural, so it can't be punched or changed, sort of take advantage of new technology, essentially by inserting that new technology into the architectural space. So this is what happens to the shopping mall in Montevideo, which is the first shopping mall ever built in Uruguay. Incredible double curvature shell sequence, but essentially almost entirely taken over by mechanical systems. What about this one here? This is another supermarket, a grocery store that Eladio Dieste built in the 1980s that has been progressively added on by the need of the particular program, to such an extent that if you didn't know that it was there, you wouldn't actually recognize it. The vaulting is actually right behind that facade. The only thing that really remains true to the original remit and mandate of Eladio Dieste's design are the warehouses. Because the function of the warehouse in the economy of Uruguay at the time and today has not changed. And warehouses are supposed to remain enclosed, sealed almost. So you go there and you can see the religiousness of the workplace, which hasn't changed in 40, 50 years. In this particular case, only 20 years ago, and is one of the most perfect example of that particular structural solution. Now, what happens to those warehouses, though, if technology, if commerce, if production evolves and produces new requirements? So this is possibly the most famous, I would say, Corentin, the second most famous building in Eladio Dieste's production, the Agroindustria Massaro warehouses, self-standing shells, which have a span which is extremely long, I can't remember how many hundred meters. Now they're actually owned by a French conglomerate, Timac Agro, in Canelones. The image on the right, top and right, is the cover page of the book that Stan Anderson produced at MIT a few years ago, in which you see this rarefied image with this lever of light that comes into the shells. And the big image is the one that I took when I went there. What you won't see in the book by Anderson, or the previous book done by a Spanish publisher, is the extent to which the initial volume for the offices has been changed. And it has been changed because the Massaro company has changed and other functions tend to be incorporated into the initial scheme. And so it is a scheme that was so rigid that had to be sort of pushed with other volumes onto it. Volumes that actually incorporate as well structural elements that are the famous structural elements in that particular composition. But what's more worrisome from my point of view is what happens if you actually turn 180 degrees and you don't look at the office, but you look at the warehouse where people work. Because that's how the building has been screened now in order to replace the original spaces with new equipment. And possibly we don't have enough light, but you can see the smoke, dark spots that come out of the shell that unfortunately remind me of some of the images that I showed you from 100 years back in Bangladesh and New York. Be that as it may, what happens then when you actually come out of these particular components, they start driving along the Ruta 5, which is the main industrial highway in Paraguay, the one that brings together production sites and distribution sites. You will witness a progressive replacement of the type. So you have something on the right, which is El Adio Dieste, which is then being integrated by the one in the center from the 1980s, 1990s. And then you have that evanescent volume made out of metal components, metal paneling, which is essentially what is being constructed today. So as you move closer to the city, where the cost of labor and the speed of construction are more demanding, a heroic type of building is being replaced by much more mundane ones that are far too convenient to overlook. And so what happens when you go back to the countryside, you will see that El Adio Dieste's buildings survive insofar as they only cover particular surfaces, if they can work as siluses, as they can work as mute spaces. The moment a different function is required, they are replaced by something else. What you see in the countryside is smaller buildings that are not done by him, are done by sort of local architects, local building surveyors, even communities, which take up some of the motives, formal motives of El Adio Dieste, but they actually diminish their size and make them part of a composition of a regional language. Other than that, you can see there is a sort of a structural shrewdness and structural material selection that takes over, and you can see that in the same villages, other than the one on top, which is Montevideo, that local inventiveness takes over, and instead of using bricks, they use metal components. And so at the end of the story, you go back towards Montevideo, and you're left with these piles of bricks that are still being produced across the countryside, but they're no longer used for those buildings, only for ancillary structures in farmhouses. So at the end of this, how do we look at these particular experiences from the point of view of my simplified model of the industry? There is no doubt that in those three cases, we have a formidable bind between form and process, between the conception of the volume and the engineering of it. This is what makes it what it is. In the first case, it was actually done by the architects. There was no procedural component in place, and they simply had to do it by absence of other things. In the middle one with the Guastavino, there was an incredible combination of events whereby a builder could actually be also the researcher, could actually build the component fabricator, and could be completely integrated with the architectural profession. So it was a win-win situation until the technological paradigm and the culture of design changed. It was replaced by a different model of building, a different palette of materials. Whereas the third one is El Adio Dieste, also incredibly fortunate to exist as a professional in Paraguay at that particular time. He was a winning situation as well. He was the engineer, he was fully in control of the production process. He produced some very serious research, R&D, onto the construction techniques and components of the building. But what made his buildings exhaust their function was the change of the economic base in Paraguay. And essentially the development of a much larger export function for agriculture was taken over by other companies. Nation building was no longer an issue, and El Adio Dieste's building lost their poignancy and cultural centrality. Now, what do this lesson tell us about the Drone Port project? Well, one could say that most of these elements actually apply to the Drone Port project as well, for reasons that I will explain in a moment quickly. There are other things that are quite specific to it. And in fact, Norman Foster's, I'm taking all this from the L'Architecture Aujourd'hui issue, in which I think Foster generously put these images there because they show the design process. There is a reference to Isla there, so which I translate as a reference to Crissier, because if one goes to Crissier here, can actually look at the tennis hall built by Hisler in 1980, which contains essentially some of the problems or challenges that Norman Foster is talking about. How to connect the two shells, but also how to incorporate services and waterproof the building. In fact, when we go to Crissier, we understand the importance, for instance, of the stormwater management, given that the two shells form a funnel. And when we get even closer, you can actually see how a very simple form can actually produce some technological challenges the moment you try to seal it, to protect it from the weather, to make sure that it doesn't take too many animals, as it happens in Uruguay. And so, for instance, the mullions of the curtain window have to have a capping that changes on each one of them, because of course the geometry of the connection changes. Then you can actually see the flashing and the capping of the metal component that has to be cut into pieces and welded piece by piece. And then you can see the skirting of the rim of the shell that has to do with the capillarization of the water into the facade. So even something which is so simple does indeed require the development of a system of component that must be designed. The drawn port at the moment doesn't contain that information, and of course it is information that will have to be developed, otherwise the building will not be viable for the uses that has been imagined for. At the moment, is a closed system the way it appears. It is inflexible and absolute because of the sculptural richness of its proposition, and it is sensitive to non-optimal practice, in a sense that the inventiveness of the engineering makes it robust in a sense that you can make some mistakes, but you can't make too many mistakes. Otherwise, the building will not work structurally the way it's supposed to do. The technology of the assembly requires supervision and training in the same way it required supervision and training in Cuba, where it didn't work because the workforce was unskilled, as well as in New York, Boston, Buffalo, and eventually Uruguay, where both Guastavino and Eladio Dieste had to develop a very proficient set of skilled workers. Especially simple, it has a low ratio of usable volume and gross volume. It's actually difficult to build incrementally unless you plan it beforehand. So there is a number of things that make the project look like the challenge that it really is. And it really is any time you try to import a new technology into a different environment. If one looked at this particular enterprise from a commercial point of view, without boring you with all the details, one could say that it would be very unlikely that a commercial operator would want to engage with such a project unless there were conditions, particular conditions of extendable market rents. So unless one could establish a monopoly for that type of construction, which is exactly the same thing that happened in Uruguay as well as in New York with the Guastavino brothers. Investment was worth making provided that you had a guarantee that additional work would come. In this particular case, it's unlikely that additional work would come from other markets because the building typology is actually very specific to that program. Now, could it be that in fact for this particular type of buildings, we could consider ways of moving the axis? And rather than looking at the alliance between form and process, considering what would happen if the alliance changed from form to components in such a way as to allow the components to inform the rest of the industry and eventually go back to the process. Now, I have two photographs. Here is my mother, so that you get to know the entire family. And I'm not showing you that photograph because I wanted to introduce her to the public, but because I wanted to focus on the building right behind it. She came to see me while I was traveling in South America, and I was in Ollantaytambo, in the Valley of Gods in Peru, and I'm sure that whoever rendered that particular drawing by Norman Foster and Partners had this particular image in mind, in sight. What is the difference between these two images? That one essentially projects a completely different type of building vis-a-vis the building fabric which is before it or below it. Whereas the one on the left, on the right, and I'll show you, has a building which is a very, very famous storehouse here, right behind my mother, which is essentially using exactly the same materials and exactly the same typology as the village below it. And so this is it. This is my own blowout of that image, whereas this is the Pinkuyuna Kolka, is an Inca warehouse which dates back to the 15th century and is one of the most enlightened examples of environmental design and technological development. The materials are the same. They can actually be brought up one by one. The section of the building is not defined by the building itself, but by the program of the building and the topography of the site, and is done in such a way as to incorporate the environmental pressure of the climate. So they do it in such a way as to have a thatch roof that allows ventilation under the roof that goes up, of course, and then they have a circulation pattern that goes between the building in such a way as to deliver the seats for storage on the top and then start using that as you go down and are taken back to the village on the way down. So there is a ventilation system, there is a use system, there is a construction system, and there is an economic development system because they all had to produce these materials in batches across the valley. The reason I'm showing you this is because when you go and look at the drawings, at the images of the Red Line and Future Africa on the right, and then you compare them with the Drawn Port project on the other, you see that there is space for dialogue, in a sense that, maybe, I don't know whether it's the initial proposition or the eventual decision, but this is a building, the one on the right, that reminds one much more of the functional ideas embedded into the Incas' storehouses of the 15th century. And if we look into it again and try to establish connections with other testimonies of recent architectural practice, we can actually see that there are a lot of elements that refer back to Jorn Utzon's work in the 1970s. In fact, Utzon has actually produced the new entry to the Opera House, which is almost exactly like the Drawn Port that is imagined at EPFL, and possibly it takes it from this project here, which is the Assembly Hall in Kuwait, done in 1972 and finished building in 1982 with a structural engineer from Zurich, in which he makes a proposition that when you build in a developing industry, in a developing economy industry, you need to prefabricate. You need to devise an open system that builds quality into the components and then brings them together through an additive process. And for the designer of the Sydney Opera House, it was a major statement to make. Through the Sydney Opera House and the prefabrication exercise there, he decides that he has to simplify even more, otherwise he will not be able to transfer the technology that has acquired. And it's interesting that if we actually move even further, we will see that one of the utmost examples of this additive technology is the one provided by Foster and Partners for the construction and the design of Stansted Airport that was finished in 1991, which is literally an explosion of components, of trades, of minuscule technologies, each one of them giving potentially rise to a new set of practices. The history of that particular strategy is a very rich history that contains structural engineering masterpieces, things that have been done in the post-colonial world. This is the market, a famous market in Nairobi. On the right-hand side, you have the Il Piso de Molina market in Santiago, which is an incredible project with the most incredible light conditions you can imagine, which is essentially typologically the same as the airport at Stansted, which is extremely well defined in its technological component, in the performance of its assembly, but also very flexible in the way people can use it. And so in the end, what you can actually get to, if you take this particular approach, is that you can arrive at a situation where there are two buildings that are essentially exactly the same project, but built, designed in different industrial realities. So we have the Maggie's Cancer Centre, built in London in 2007 by Rogers, Sturt and partners, and which is a small clinic in England. And on the right, you have the Centre for the Well-Being of Women for Genital Mutilation in Burkina Faso, done my colleague Riccardo Vannucci, who is working with me at FAR, which is exactly the same project, done exactly at the same time by using different materials and building systems in the same topological relationship. Which means that building can actually change, evolve, change components progressively and settle and sit and live a new life, provided that the space for the permutation of those elements is kept in check. And this is essentially the diagram that myself and my student and now colleague and friend Melinda Patiraja set up together 10 years ago as a theory. That if we could actually define an architecture that is made out of parts that can change depending on the market and depending on the skills of the laborers involved, then those very laborers will be able to go through one market, learn their trade, move into other market, and by doing so, develop the industry and better their own conditions. So this did not want to be a critic, can't be a criticism to that project or any other project, but it's one way of making a number of points clear. Essentially, we have two buildings that are, 25 years of distance, chronological distance apart. The first one is the Drone Port in Venice that essentially develops on the axis form process. The second one to the right is the Stansted Airport, which I consider one of the most important project experiences of the last century, that develops along the axis components and performances. One doesn't have to choose between one or the other, but one has to understand that there is the space in between, which is the space for design maneuvering. And in electing how to maneuver between those two spaces, one, I think, can achieve that sort of political role that both Che Guevara in 1963 and, of course, Le Corbusier in 1922 would actually pose as a critical question for architecture. Now, I'm finishing here. And so the question is, how are we going to use this? Well, I think we have to use it politically as well. And we cannot not use it politically, because if we put architecture or architectural evolution into this sort of larger focus, the choices that we take not only a formal dimension, but also a broader strategic one. And it is the realization of this potential, to me, that makes the architectural work political. And if you will, political not in the way we traditionally use it, which has to do with representative action or deliberative action, but rather with the fact that for architecture to be political in this way, it must contain conflict, difference, evolution, and eventually find the way to deal with all of this. Because if it doesn't, the buildings will die. And so in opening up to this landscape, it is the root of the word political, that is polis, that takes on a double meaning. And one is literally, I think, associable with multiplicity. That has to be the multiplicity of approaches, points of view, alternatives, and systems of value. And the other one that relates to the construction of what's beyond the building, or what's between the building. And I mean the city as an ethical construct. So polis, literally. Now, if you consider this, the fact that architecture and engineering in this particular case are not disciplines, but rather something that one could consider as an operative approach to world making, then if this is true, then this also clarifies the importance of institutions that are capable to bridge, to straddle across, to steer together areas of knowledge that would be too much for any discipline to try and master. And it is not by accident that polis, I think, still defines that name and implies their ability to be discerning and proactive about the mandate. And I guess it is in recognition of the privilege of being part of being now part, finally, of one of such institutions that I wanted to celebrate the journey. They started notionally 100 years ago. It can be used in my mind to gauge progress of any time, whilst being mindful of the many that live and work today in our past to serve our present. Buildings are us, wherever they are. Thank you.
Many thanks, Paolo, for a wonderful lecture. I invite the audience to ask questions if there are any. It seems the shyness is part of the culture tonight. So, Paolo, I would like to thank you again very much for enlightening us about construction, history, and a journey through both the culture of architecture and construction for an hour and a half. So thank you very much and welcome again to EPFL. Before I invite you to join us for an apéro, I would just like to make a little note to one of you in the room, Luca. Luca is going to leave his post as Institute Director in 4 days, and I think it is only right to give him a little bit of a note. I won't give a big speech because tonight is Nicola Braghieri and Paolo Tombesi's night, but I couldn't leave this room without acknowledging you, and I will do that in French. So, à la suite de ces deux leçons passionnante de la part des professeurs Nicola Braghieri et de Paolo Tombesi. Avant de tous vous inviter à cet apéritif, j'aimerais rendre aussi un hommage à Luca Ortelli, qui a à lui tout seul cumulé les deux fonctions que Nicola et Paolo représentent aujourd'hui et qui a donc été directeur de l'Institut et directeur de section en architecture. Donc bien sûr, Luca Ortelli. Aujourd'hui, ou dans 4 jours pour être précis, tu termines ton mandat comme directeur d'institut. Tu as été présent comme un soutien essentiel dès la création de la faculté en 2002, il y a déjà longtemps, où tu as accepté de devenir le tout premier directeur de la section d'architecture. Tu es resté 6 ans en assumant cette charge prenante jusqu'en 2008. Et puis en 2011, tu as à nouveau accepté de te dévouer à ton institution en acceptant la charge de directeur de l'Institut d'architecture et de la ville que tu assumes jusqu'à samedi. Et en ayant accepté de prolonger également ton mandat jusqu'à la désignation de ton successeur, Paolo, qui nous rejoint ici. Tu as été aussi membre de la direction de la faculté ENAC depuis 2006 Et j'aimerais te remercier de tout cœur, et je pense que c'est le cas de tous tes collègues, pour ton engagement extrêmement généreux, essentiel, et qui a permis à la faculté de grandir comme elle l'a fait. Ce n'est absolument pas l'heure de ta leçon d'honneur, loin de là, et donc je me réjouis que nous continuions à bénéficier à la fois de ta présence et de ta générosité et de tes contributions. Un grand merci, Luca.